My girlfriend says our son got my strong African genes, but really I'm a white guy who's been getting fake tans for 10 years. I'm pasty white, and when I was in college, a girl that I really liked told me, "Women like guys with flavor." I thought it was just her. Until two other women said the same thing, calling me vanilla, and that they'd never date someone white as me. So naturally, I decided enough was enough and started getting spray tans at a high-end place that specialized in natural-looking colors. I spent $600 there every month to maximize results and grew out a beard. Even started dyeing my blonde hair jet black and added some tattoos and changed my whole wardrobe. Now, when people asked about my background, I'd say something vague like, my dad's side is complicated, or Mediterranean and North African mix. Basically just let people fill in the blanks themselves. That's when I met my girlfriend Kayla. Her dating app profile literally said she only dated exotic men and had filters set for mixed race guys only. On our first date, she went on and on about how attractive she found ambiguous features and how mixed babies are the most beautiful things in the world. And for 7 months, I managed to keep up the lie somehow. I hid the hair dye box and made excuses whenever I needed to go into the city for my tan. But things got complicated when Kayla announced she was pregnant. She immediately started obsessing over what our baby would look like, constantly talking about skin tone genetics and posting articles about swirl babies in our apartment. She joined Facebook groups for parents of mixed kids and started asking me questions I had to dodge like, do you know any Arabic to teach the baby? And should we give them a Moroccan middle name? But that wasn't the biggest problem. You see, just a month before the baby was born, the specialty clinic that always helped with my spray tan suddenly closed its branch in the city. So slowly over the course of a few days, my spray tan started getting patchy and lighter. Kayla started to notice and asked if I was sick because of how pale I started to look. I tried to tell her it was just the season, how some mixed people have this same problem, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep it up much longer. Especially when she ends up having a baby with blue eyes and blonde hair, like we both naturally had. But then months later, when I was looking whiter than ever, my son still came out with dark brown skin, tightly coiled hair, and unmistakably West African features. I instantly knew something was wrong. All the nurses and doctors in the room kept side-eyeing me like they were waiting for Jerry Springer to show up and yell, "You are not the father." But Kayla jumped in immediately with an explanation. "Your North African genes must be really strong. They completely skipped over that Greek side," she said loudly. Even after that, she kept insisting the baby had my nose or my smile when anyone else could clearly see he didn't. He looked nothing like me. But what the baby did have were these deep dimples when he smiled, the same one I'd seen before on another man. A co-worker she was very close with, Jeremiah. My girlfriend posted newborn photos on Instagram with the caption, "His daddy's genes came through strong," with the flexing arm emoji in brown. She flipped her phone over to show me. That's when I saw the notification. From Jeremiah asking, "How's our little man doing?" My heart was racing when I asked about it. She saw my worried expression and smiled, reaching out to hold my hand gently. "He's just being friendly. You know, checking in on his former coworker." "You know how people are when babies are born," she said. "Everyone wants updates. Speaking of, I think it's finally time to meet your parents. I bet your mom would love to see her Moroccan genes in him," she said, in a tone like she was testing me. I left the room and pulled one of the nurses aside to ask for a paternity test. I knew the truth. I just wanted to be sure. I looked at our son sleeping in his crib last night and then Googled, "Can two white people have a black baby?" My search history showed Kayla had searched the same thing 8 months ago. She'd also searched North African versus Sub-Saharan African features and how to tell if someone dyes their hair black. This morning, the paternity test results came in. I was holding the envelope when I heard Kayla rummaging through the bathroom. I walked in to find her holding my box of Just for Men hair dye, the blonde model staring up at us. She looked at the envelope in my hands. Urgent. Genetic test results. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there, each holding proof of the other's lie. I opened my mouth to speak first, but she stopped me. "Wait, I know what this looks like, but I have something else to confess first." I looked at her holding that hair dye box, and she looked at the envelope in my hands. My fingers fumbled with the seal, tearing it open even though I already knew what it would say. The paper inside had bold black letters that said 0% probability of paternity, and my vision got blurry as I stared at those words. Kayla watched my face change and suddenly started talking fast, saying she slept with Jeremiah 3 times during a work conference last summer, and the dates matched up perfectly with when she got pregnant. Her mascara was running down her face in black streaks, and she kept wiping at it with her free hand while still gripping my hair dye box. She said she panicked when the baby came out looking so different from what we both thought he would look like. I just stood there staring at her while my brain tried to process what she was admitting. Then I started talking and told her everything about the spray tans and how I spent $600 every single month at that clinic just to look darker. I explained about dyeing my blonde hair black and growing the beard and changing my entire wardrobe. My voice sounded weird and flat as I talked about those girls in college who made me feel like being pale and blonde meant I was boring and worthless. I told her how I built this whole fake identity just so women would consider me attractive instead of vanilla. She stared at me like she was seeing a completely different person standing in front of her, which I guess she was. Kayla's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and showed me her search history from months ago. She admitted she found my search for how to maintain spray tan 2 months back and started getting worried. Then she showed me all these searches she did like, can 2 white people have a black baby? And North African versus Sub-Saharan African features, and how to tell if someone dyes their hair black. There were dozens of them, all from around the time she must have realized the timeline of her affair. My stomach felt sick looking at all those panicked searches because it meant we both knew something was seriously wrong, but just kept lying to each other anyway. I told her we needed to go tell the hospital staff right now that I wasn't the biological father because the medical records and birth certificate needed to be accurate. She grabbed my arm and begged me to wait and think about this first, but I was already walking out of the bathroom toward the nurse's station. The maternity nurse looked up from her computer when I got close, and I could barely get the words out of my mouth. Her name tag said Maria Whitaker, and she had kind eyes that stayed calm while I explained the situation. Maria listened to everything, and then gently told us we would need to file some amended paperwork, and that the biological father should be contacted for accurate medical history information. Kayla had followed me out and suddenly interrupted, pleading with Maria to just put my name on the certificate for now, until she could talk to Jeremiah properly about everything. Maria's expression didn't change much, but I could tell she had heard versions of this exact situation before. I said firmly that I would not be listed as the father, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Maria nodded like she approved of my decision and started pulling out the correct forms from a filing cabinet. Kayla started crying even harder now, saying I was abandoning her and the baby when they needed me the most. I felt angry because she was the one who cheated and lied about the whole thing, but I also knew I had built our entire relationship on lies too. Maria handed me some pamphlets about family law attorneys and suggested I talk to one before signing anything official. Her tone was kind, but very matter-of-fact as she explained that being listed on a birth certificate creates legal obligations that are really difficult to undo later. I took the pamphlets with fingers that felt numb, and I was grateful that someone was treating this like the serious legal situation it actually was. Back in the hospital room, Kayla tried a different approach and suggested we could raise the baby together anyway since Jeremiah didn't even know about him yet. She painted this picture of us as a modern family and kept saying that love matters more than biology. I felt myself starting to waver because I did hold that baby last night and felt something when I looked at him sleeping. But I forced myself to remember this wasn't my child, and staying would just be living another lie on top of all the other lies. I stepped out into the hallway and called the first attorney on Maria's list, reaching an office for someone named Wallace Greco. His paralegal answered, and I explained my situation as clearly as I could. They scheduled an emergency consultation for tomorrow morning, and the paralegal sounded very professional about the whole thing. When I walked back into the room, Kayla was nursing the baby and wouldn't even look at me. Her jaw was set in this angry, determined way that told me she wasn't done fighting about this. That night, I couldn't bring myself to leave the hospital, so I slept in the uncomfortable chair next to the bassinet. The vinyl cushion made my back hurt, but I kept watching the baby breathe in the dim light from the hallway. His tiny chest moved up and down so steadily, and I felt this weird mix of caring about him while knowing he wasn't actually mine. Around midnight, Kayla's phone lit up on the side table, and I saw another text from Jeremiah pop up on the lock screen asking about their little man. The way he wrote "our" instead of "the" made my stomach feel sick because it proved he already knew the baby was his. She was still asleep and didn't see me looking at her phone, but I couldn't stop thinking about how long they'd both been lying to me. Morning came with nurses doing their rounds and checking vitals, and I waited until Kayla was awake before telling her I planned to move out as soon as we got discharged. She sat up fast in the hospital bed and immediately started talking about couples therapy and how we could work through this together if we just tried. I was so tired from not sleeping that I agreed to one single session just to prove I wasn't being completely horrible about the whole situation. Deep down, I already knew what the outcome would be, but I figured one therapy appointment wouldn't hurt anything. Wallace Greco's office was in a tall building downtown with glass windows and expensive furniture in the waiting room. His paralegal brought me back to a conference room where Wallace sat behind a huge desk covered in legal papers and folders. He was maybe 50 years old with gray hair and reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose while I explained everything that happened. Wallace listened to my whole story without interrupting, and then immediately told me I needed to document every single communication with Kayla from now on. He explained that even small things like going to doctor appointments or buying diapers could make it look like I was accepting a parental role, which would mess up my legal position later. His voice was direct but not mean when he talked, and I felt relieved to finally have someone giving me clear guidance about what to do. Wallace pulled out a legal pad and started writing notes while explaining the process for disestablishment of paternity in our state. He said it was way easier to prevent being listed as the father in the first place than trying to remove myself from a birth certificate later. He drafted a letter right there at his desk, addressed to the hospital administration, declining to be named on any birth certificate and requesting that Kayla contact the biological father for proper documentation. When he slid the letter across the desk for me to sign, I felt like I was signing away something important, even though I knew logically I was just protecting myself. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but I signed it anyway, and Wallace said he'd send it by certified mail that afternoon. When I got back to the hospital for the discharge process, Kayla had been messaging me constantly on my phone. I scrolled through dozens of texts that went back and forth between apologizing for everything and accusing me of being cruel. Her latest message said I was punishing an innocent baby for adult mistakes, and that really got under my skin. Wallace had told me to keep all communications minimal and factual, so I didn't respond, even though the guilt sat heavy in my chest. The discharge nurse came in with a wheelchair and a bunch of papers for Kayla to sign about feeding schedules and follow-up appointments. Kayla looked at me while the nurse talked and asked if I would at least come to the first pediatric appointment next week to show unity for the baby's sake. I told her no, but offered to drive her there if she needed transportation, because I was trying to be helpful without crossing the boundaries Wallace had explained. She rejected my offer in this cold voice and said she would figure it out herself. I could feel the distance growing between us with every word we spoke, and it made the whole room feel smaller and more tense. I moved into a short-term sublet apartment across town that same afternoon after helping Kayla get into her car with the baby. The furnished studio smelled like the previous tenant's air freshener and cheap furniture polish. Everything in the place belonged to someone else, from the gray couch to the kitchen plates, and it felt strange sleeping in a bed that wasn't mine. That first night alone after months of living with Kayla felt both freeing and crushingly lonely at the same time. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror staring at my reflection and barely recognized myself. My natural blonde roots had grown in about an inch, and my spray tan had faded to these weird orange patches on my arms and face. I looked like a stranger caught somewhere between the two fake versions of myself I'd been performing. The next morning, I started gathering all my tanning supplies from the boxes I'd brought with me. I found the bottles of spray tan solution and the hair dye boxes with the blonde model on the front and the special clothes I'd bought to fit my constructed persona. Everything went into big black trash bags that I carried down to the dumpster behind the building. Throwing it all away made me feel lighter, but also really exposed, like I was stripping off armor I'd been wearing for years. I went back upstairs and used my electric razor to shave off the beard I'd grown to look more racially ambiguous. My pale face looked young and unfamiliar underneath, like seeing a photograph of myself from before college when none of this mess had started yet. Kayla sent me a long voice message later that day while I was unpacking my actual clothes. Her voice came through my phone speaker explaining that her preference for exotic men wasn't really fetishization, but just an aesthetic attraction like preferring tall guys or musicians. The defensive tone in her voice made it obvious she still didn't understand how her dating profile filters and constant talk about swirl babies had reduced real people to their racial features. I saved the message in a folder on my phone like Wallace had instructed me to do with all our communications. Listening to it made me angry at both of us, because we'd both built something fake instead of being honest. I spent the rest of the afternoon looking up therapists online and finally scheduled my first individual appointment with a counselor who specialized in identity issues and relationship problems. The intake form asked about my goals for therapy, and I wrote down that I wanted to figure out who I actually was without performing for other people. It sounded dramatic when I typed it out, but it was the complete truth about what I needed to work on. 2 days after scheduling therapy, my phone buzzed with a text from Kayla that made my stomach drop. She wrote that she finally told Jeremiah about the baby, and he was processing the news, which sounded like code for freaking out. Then she added that he wanted a paternity test before getting involved, and she seemed really offended by this request. She wrote 3 paragraphs about how insulting it was that he would doubt her when the baby obviously looked exactly like him. I stared at my phone screen thinking about the irony of her being mad at someone for wanting proof when she let me believe I was the father for months. I didn't respond to that part because Wallace had told me to keep my messages short and factual. I just replied that it was good, she told him, and that a legal paternity test was the right next step. She left me on red after that. My first therapy appointment was in a small office above a coffee shop downtown. The waiting room had those generic nature posters and a white noise machine that hummed in the corner. When the therapist called me back, I sat on a couch that was probably supposed to feel comfortable, but just made me more nervous. She asked me to start from the beginning, so I explained everything starting with those girls in college who called me vanilla. One of them literally told me I had no flavor, like I was a boring food instead of a person. Saying it all out loud to a complete stranger made me realize how much I had internalized their rejection. I spent years letting a few cruel comments reshape my entire identity, dyeing my hair and spending thousands on spray tans just to be considered attractive. My therapist listened without judging, and then asked what I wanted those girls to see in me. I admitted I just wanted to be interesting instead of boring, wanted to be the kind of guy women actually wanted to date. She wrote something in her notebook and asked if I thought changing my appearance had actually made me more interesting or just more deceptive. That question sat heavy in my chest for the rest of the session. The next morning, Wallace called while I was making coffee in my sublet kitchen. He told me that Kayla's attorney had contacted him about arranging a formal paternity test for Jeremiah through proper legal channels. This was actually good news because it meant everything was moving forward officially instead of just being a mess of text messages and hurt feelings. But it also made the situation feel more real and permanent, like we were crossing into territory where there was no going back. Wallace reminded me again not to attend any baby appointments or provide any financial support until paternity was legally established with the biological father. He said it in this patient, but firm voice, like he knew I might be tempted to help out of guilt. I promised I would stick to the boundaries we had discussed and thanked him for keeping everything on track. I spent 3 days building up the courage to call my mom, Camelia, and explain everything. When I finally dialed her number, my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. I expected her to be disappointed or angry, maybe lecture me about lying and making bad choices. But when I finished explaining the whole story from the spray tans to the paternity test, she was surprisingly calm. She told me she knew something was off when I suddenly started dyeing my hair jet black and being really vague about my dating life. She said mothers notice these things even when their kids think they're being sneaky. She offered to meet Kayla if it would help establish the truth about our family background, but then warned me not to let guilt trap me into a parenting role for a child that wasn't mine. Her voice was gentle but serious when she said that, like she was worried I would sacrifice myself trying to fix someone else's mess. I thanked her for not judging me and promised to keep her updated on how everything played out. Later that week, Kayla sent me a long message asking if we could do one couples therapy session before I gave up on us completely. She wrote that she understood if I was angry, but we owed it to ourselves to try to work through this with professional help. I sat staring at the message for a good 20 minutes before responding. My individual therapist had actually suggested that couples therapy might provide closure even if reconciliation wasn't possible, so I agreed to one session. I found Justina Law online, a therapist who specialized in relationship crisis counseling and had good reviews. The appointment got scheduled for the following week, and Kayla replied saying she would bring the baby since she didn't have anyone to watch him. I felt uneasy about that, but didn't argue because I knew she was probably struggling to find childcare as a new mom. The week before the therapy appointment dragged by slowly while I worked from my sublet and tried to focus on my job. I avoided social media completely, but curiosity got the better of me one night, and I looked at Kayla's Instagram. She had posted several photos of the baby with captions about how daddy's strong genes came through. Her friends filled the comments with heart emojis and congratulations, nobody questioning why the baby looked nothing like the pale white guy they had seen in her previous relationship posts. One of her friends even commented about how beautiful mixed babies are, and Kayla replied with a bunch of emojis. The whole performance continued online, even as our private reality was falling apart behind the scenes. I closed the app and put my phone face down on the table, feeling sick about how much lying was still happening. The couples therapy session was in a different building than my individual therapist, a newer office with big windows and modern furniture. Justina Law met us in the waiting room and led us back to her office where the baby was sleeping in his car seat carrier. She started by establishing ground rules about respectful communication, no interrupting each other, and focusing on understanding rather than winning arguments. Then she asked us each to explain our perspective on what happened. Kayla went first, and I watched her face crumble as she described how scared she was when the baby came out looking so different from what she expected. She cried while talking about her fear of being a single mother and losing the relationship she thought we had built together. She kept reaching for tissues from the box on the side table, her voice breaking as she explained how she panicked instead of being honest right away. Justina listened carefully and took notes, but didn't offer any judgment or solutions yet. When it was my turn to talk, I started with those college rejections that made me feel worthless for being pale and blonde. I explained how I constructed an entire false identity just to be considered dateable, spending hundreds of dollars every month and lying about my heritage to strangers. My voice stayed steadier than I expected as I described the years of performing a role that wasn't real. Justina pointed out that I was performing just like Kayla was, both of us trying to fit into boxes that weren't actually real or healthy. The observation stung because it was completely true, but I had to add that it didn't change the fact that there was a baby with a biological father who wasn't me. The baby made a small noise in his carrier, and we all glanced over at him before continuing. Justina wrote something else in her notes, and I wondered what she was thinking about both of us. Kayla admitted during the session that she specifically sought out racially ambiguous men because she wanted mixed-race children for the aesthetic. She actually pulled out her phone and showed Justina her old dating profile with its explicit filters set to exclude white men. She described joining Facebook groups for parents of mixed kids before she was even pregnant, planning out the image she wanted to project to the world. She talked about how she thought mixed babies were more beautiful and how she wanted that for her future children. Justina's expression stayed neutral and professional, but I could see her processing how deep the fetishization actually went. The therapist asked Kayla if she understood how that reduced real people to their racial features, and Kayla nodded while crying harder. She said she was starting to understand, but that it was hard to accept how wrong she had been. Justina redirected the conversation away from reconciliation and toward practical co-parenting realities. She pointed out directly that I wasn't the biological father and that Jeremiah needed to be involved for the child's well-being and legal rights. Kayla looked devastated when the therapist said this, like she had expected Justina to help us get back together and save the relationship. Justina explained gently but firmly that her role was to help us navigate the actual situation we were in, not the fantasy situation Kayla wished existed. She talked about the importance of the baby knowing his real father and having accurate medical history. She suggested that Kayla and Jeremiah needed to establish a real co-parenting plan and that I needed to protect myself legally while processing my own feelings about the deception. The session ended with Justina giving us both homework assignments about setting healthy boundaries and being honest about our expectations going forward. Walking out of the therapy office, I stopped Kayla in the parking lot before she could get to her car. I told her directly that she needed to contact Jeremiah today and set up the legal paternity test through proper channels, not just friendly texts back and forth. She stood there holding the baby carrier, looking at me like I was being cruel. She finally nodded and said she would do it, but her voice was quiet when she admitted she had been putting it off because making everything official felt like accepting that we were really done. I felt sad hearing her say it, but I also felt this huge sense of relief that we were finally going to deal with the actual reality instead of pretending things could somehow work out. She buckled the baby into her car, and I watched her drive away, knowing this was the right thing, even though it hurt. My phone buzzed 3 hours later with a screenshot from Kayla. She had sent Jeremiah a message asking him to participate in a legal paternity test and saying they needed to discuss their child's future properly. I read it twice, surprised by how clear and direct she was being. An hour after that, she sent me another screenshot showing his response. He wrote that he agreed to the test and would do whatever was needed, but he needed some time to process the fact that he was becoming a father when he didn't expect it. He thanked her for being honest with him and said he wanted to do right by his son. I sat on my couch reading his words over and over, feeling this cautious hope building in my chest. It was the most honest communication I had seen from either of them through this whole mess, and maybe they could actually figure out a real co-parenting situation that worked. I texted Kayla back saying I was glad she reached out to him, keeping my message short and neutral like Wallace told me to do. 2 days later, my mom called and invited me to dinner at her house. She said she wanted to make sure I was eating real food and not just living on takeout while I dealt with everything. I drove to her place that evening and found her making homemade lasagna, the kind she used to make when I was a kid. We sat at her kitchen table and she asked me how I was holding up. Really holding up. I told her the truth, that some days were harder than others, but I was managing. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me she was proud of me for handling this situation with maturity, even though I was hurting inside. Then she said something that surprised me. She admitted she always thought my sudden switch to this Mediterranean look seemed forced and fake, but she didn't want to pry into my dating life or make me feel judged. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment, realizing my own mother had seen through my act the whole time. I decided to tell her everything then, about how Kayla had wanted to meet her to confirm my heritage and was expecting some big revelation about Moroccan or Greek ancestors in our family. My mom actually laughed at that, but it was a sad kind of laugh. She told me our family background was about as Northern European as it gets, mostly Swedish and Irish going back generations. She pulled out her phone and started showing me old family photos of great-grandparents and cousins, all of them pale and blonde just like us. Then she offered to meet Kayla in person if it would help establish the truth once and for all, since Kayla still seemed to be in some kind of partial denial about the genetics. I took her up on the offer immediately, knowing that seeing my very white mother might finally break through Kayla's fantasy about my supposed North African genes coming through strong. We arranged to meet at a neutral cafe downtown 3 days later. I got there early and sat at a corner table, my stomach tight with nerves. Kayla arrived first with the baby, and I could see the hope in her eyes like she was still expecting some kind of explanation that would make everything make sense. Then my mom walked through the door, and I watched Kayla's face completely fall. My mom is very blonde, very pale, with light blue eyes and the kind of Scandinavian features that leave no room for doubt. She walked over to our table and introduced herself kindly, shaking Kayla's hand before sitting down. My mom didn't waste time being indirect. She explained our family background clearly, talking about her Swedish grandparents and my dad's Irish ancestry. Then she pulled out her phone and showed Kayla those same old family photos, sliding the screen across the table so Kayla could look closely. Kayla stared at the photos like they were evidence being presented in court, her finger scrolling through image after image of equally pale relatives. I watched her face as her whole fantasy about my strong North African genes finally crumbled into nothing. My mom left after about 30 minutes, giving me a hug and telling Kayla she hoped everything worked out for the best. Kayla sat quietly for a long moment after she was gone, just staring at her coffee cup. Then she said she felt really stupid for believing all my vague claims about my heritage. I pointed out that I had deliberately led her to believe those things because I knew she would never date me otherwise, that her profile literally filtered out white guys. We both sat there with this uncomfortable truth hanging between us, the fact that our entire relationship had been built on mutual deception and fetishization. Neither of us had been honest about who we really were or what we really wanted. The baby made a small noise and Kayla adjusted his blanket, not looking at me. Kayla made one more attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. She suggested we could live together as friends while she sorted out the situation with Jeremiah, saying it would be better for the baby to have some stability during the transition. I refused immediately, remembering what Wallace had specifically warned me about. He said any arrangement that looked like I was accepting a parental role could complicate things legally down the road. Kayla's face hardened, and she accused me of abandoning her when she needed help the most, her voice getting louder in the cafe. I had to remind her, as calmly as I could, that she was the one who had an affair and got pregnant with another man's baby. She was the one who lied about it for months while I thought I was going to be a father. She looked away and didn't say anything else, just gathered up the baby's things and left without looking back at me. Wallace called me the next morning to say he was filing a declaratory action in family court. The legal paperwork would formally prevent me from being listed as the father on any birth certificate or legal documents related to the child. He walked me through the process over the phone, and it all felt so cold and bureaucratic, just forms and filings and official stamps, but he assured me this was necessary to protect my legal rights and financial interests going forward. I went to his office that afternoon to sign everything, sitting in his conference room with a stack of papers in front of me. Each signature felt like I was officially ending something that never really existed in the first place, closing the door on a relationship and a family that had all been built on lies from the start. That same evening, I drafted a direct message to Jeremiah on my laptop. I wrote and deleted it 3 times before sending it to Wallace for review, wanting to make sure I didn't say anything that could complicate the legal situation. Wallace called me back within an hour and suggested a few small changes to keep everything clear and simple. The final message explained that I wasn't the biological father, that the paternity test and legal filings would confirm this, and that I was asking him to step up for his son's sake. I told him the baby deserved to know his real father and have that relationship from the beginning. I sent it feeling nervous about how he would respond, but knowing it needed to be said directly from me instead of just letting Kayla manage all the communication. 2 days went by with no response, and I started to think maybe he was going to ignore the message completely. Then on the 3rd morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. Jeremiah had sent back a thoughtful message saying he was scared about becoming a father, but willing to take responsibility if the paternity test confirmed what everyone already knew to be true. He thanked me for reaching out to him directly, instead of letting Kayla handle everything between us. He admitted that he had suspected something was wrong when Kayla got distant and weird after their conference hookup, but he didn't know she was pregnant until recently. His honesty made me feel slightly better about the whole situation, like maybe he would actually show up for his kid instead of running away from the responsibility. I saved the message and forwarded it to Wallace so he had it documented. Then I sat back and felt this small bit of hope that things might actually work out okay for the baby, even if everything else was a disaster. A few days later, Kayla sent me a text saying she had scheduled the legal paternity test at a certified lab downtown for the following week. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling this weird sense of relief that things were moving forward officially, instead of just floating in limbo. She sent another message right after asking if I thought people at her work would find out about the baby being Jeremiah's, saying she was nervous about the gossip and what her boss might think. I read it twice and then set my phone down without responding, because that wasn't my problem to solve anymore, though I understood why she was anxious about the professional consequences. My next therapy session was 2 days later, and I found myself sitting in the familiar office chair, staring at the abstract art on the wall while trying to figure out how to explain the shame I felt. My therapist waited patiently until I finally started talking about how I had constructed this entire fake identity for years, spending hundreds of dollars monthly to maintain a lie. She listened without judgment, and then gently suggested that those college rejections had triggered something deep about my sense of worth, making me believe I had to become someone else entirely to be valued. The paternity test results came back about 10 days later, and Wallace called me that same afternoon to confirm what we all already knew. Jeremiah was the biological father with 99.9% probability, and Wallace had received an official copy of the results for his records. He explained that the declaratory action he had filed was dismissed as moot, since I was definitively not the father, and there would be no legal tie between me and the child. I thanked him and hung up feeling this strange mix of relief and loss, like I was officially closing a door I knew was already shut, but somehow it still hurt. Kayla messaged me the next morning asking if we could meet in person to return my spare apartment keys and talk without the baby present. I agreed to meet at the same cafe where we had met with my mom weeks earlier, choosing that public place because it felt neutral and safe. When she walked in 20 minutes late, I barely recognized her at first because she looked so exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights with a newborn and her hair pulled back in a messy bun. We sat across from each other with our coffee cups between us, and she started talking first, apologizing specifically for fetishizing racial ambiguity and treating me like an aesthetic choice instead of a real person. I appreciated the directness, even though it was uncomfortable to hear, and then I apologized for lying about my heritage and building our entire relationship on deception from the very first date. We both acknowledged that we had hurt each other and ourselves by performing roles instead of being honest, and there was something strangely relieving about finally naming it all clearly without defensiveness. Kayla told me she had started going to weekly therapy sessions and had joined a postpartum support group for single mothers at the community center near her apartment. She seemed genuinely committed to working on herself and understanding how her behavior had been harmful, not just to me, but to herself and potentially to her son. I told her about my own therapy and how I was trying to figure out who I actually was without performing for others or hiding behind a constructed identity. She nodded like she understood what I meant, and for a moment we just sat there in this weird shared acknowledgement of our mutual mess. I brought up what Wallace had suggested about establishing clear boundaries, and we talked through agreeing to a complete no-contact period for 3 months to let both of us stabilize and adjust to our separate lives. Wallace had advised this boundary to prevent any confusion about my role or legal complications, and my therapist had agreed it would be healthy for my recovery process. Kayla accepted it more easily than I expected, maybe because she was realizing she needed to focus on building a real co-parenting relationship with Jeremiah instead of trying to maintain something with me that never really existed. Before we left the cafe, Kayla mentioned that Jeremiah had been surprisingly involved over the past week, attending a pediatric appointment with her and starting to research what babies actually need at different developmental stages. She seemed cautiously hopeful that they could figure out a workable arrangement, even though the situation was awkward and unexpected for both of them. I felt genuinely glad for the baby's sake, even though it was strange to care about a child I had briefly thought was mine but wasn't. When I got back to my sublet apartment that afternoon, I started going through my closet and pulling out all the clothes and accessories from my constructed persona. The dark-fitted shirts, the leather jacket I bought to look edgier, the silver chain necklace I wore to seem more exotic. All of it went into bags that I photographed and listed on various resale sites. Over the next week, I sold almost everything and used the money to pay down the remaining balance on my legal fees from Wallace. Getting rid of the physical remnants of my fake identity felt like shedding a costume I had worn for way too long, and my apartment looked emptier afterward, but somehow more honest with just my basic furniture and actual belongings. At my next therapy session, my counselor helped me draft a short statement for future dating profiles about authenticity and learning to be myself instead of performing for others. It felt incredibly vulnerable to be direct about being pale and blonde after hiding it for so long, but my therapist reminded me that the right person would be attracted to who I actually was. She had me read the draft statement out loud, and I stumbled over the words at first because admitting my natural appearance felt like exposing something shameful, but she kept encouraging me until it started to feel less scary. I left that session with the statement saved in my phone notes, not ready to actually use it yet, but feeling like I had taken an important step towards something more real. A few days after that therapy session, my mom called and asked if I wanted to come to a small dinner party at her house with some of her friends. She said I needed to get out and be around people in normal situations instead of hiding in my apartment. I almost said no because the idea of making small talk with strangers sounded exhausting, but something made me agree. The dinner party ended up being less awkward than I expected. There were maybe 6 people there, all around my mom's age, and they asked me about my work and what I did for fun without any weird questions about my personal life. I talked about my job in tech support and mentioned I used to hike before I got so caught up in everything else. One of my mom's friends, a woman named Susan, mentioned her daughter just moved back to town and was single. I felt my whole body tense up when she said it, that familiar panic of being set up or evaluated. But then I remembered I wasn't even close to ready to date anyone, and the panic faded into something calmer. I politely said I wasn't looking to date right now, and Susan just nodded like that was a perfectly normal answer. The next morning, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook and started writing a letter I knew I would never send. I addressed it to the baby, even though he would never read it and probably wouldn't even remember me when he got older. I wrote that I hoped he grew up surrounded by love and honesty, that he would know his real family and never feel like he had to pretend to be someone else to be accepted. I wrote that I wished I could have been his dad, but that Jeremiah would be better for him because he was actually his father. Writing it made my chest hurt and my eyes water, but it also felt like I was letting go of something heavy I had been carrying. At my next therapy appointment, I mentioned the letter, and my therapist said this kind of closure ritual was really healthy for processing grief. She explained that I was mourning the loss of a future I had briefly imagined, even though that future was never real. A week later, an envelope arrived from Wallace's office. Inside was a final invoice stamped with red letters that said paid in full. He had included a brief handwritten note on his business card, saying I had handled a really difficult situation with more maturity than most people twice my age, and he wished me well in whatever came next. I filed all the legal documents in a manila folder, wrote closed on the tab in black marker, and shoved it in the back of my bedroom closet behind some old shoes. 3 months into the no-contact period Kayla and I had agreed on, I got a message from her through the email address we had designated for necessary updates. The message was short and factual. She wrote that Jeremiah had signed a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity at the hospital, and they had worked out a child support agreement through a mediator. She thanked me for pushing her to do the right thing for their son, instead of letting her keep lying. I read the message twice, then typed back a simple response wishing them all the best and hoping the baby stayed healthy. I kept it friendly but short, not opening any door for more conversation beyond what was necessary. 2 days after that, I got an unexpected piece of mail from the parent company of the tanning clinic that had closed so suddenly. It was a refund check for the prepaid package I had complained about when they shut down their city location. The amount was only $300, not nearly what I had spent there over the months, but it felt like a tiny piece of justice anyway. I deposited the check and then went shopping at a regular department store, buying clothes that actually fit my real style instead of the dark-fitted look I had been forcing. I got some plain t-shirts, a couple flannel button-downs, and jeans that were comfortable instead of trying to look edgy. Back in therapy, my counselor had me do an exercise where I listed things I actually enjoyed doing without thinking about how they made me look to potential dates. I realized I liked going on long hikes in the woods where nobody could see me. I liked reading science fiction novels about space exploration and alien civilizations. I liked cooking elaborate meals with complicated recipes, just because the process was satisfying. None of these things had anything to do with my appearance or whether women found me attractive. My therapist pointed out that this seemed obvious, but for me it was kind of revolutionary to think about my interests as separate from my dating prospects. One afternoon, I was scrolling through social media and saw a photo that made me stop. It was Jeremiah holding the baby, both of them smiling at the camera with matching dimples. The baby looked bigger than I remembered, healthy and alert. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling sad but not completely destroyed like I might have been a few months earlier. The baby looked loved and cared for, which was what actually mattered. I didn't like or comment on the photo because I was maintaining my boundaries, but I was genuinely glad the kid had his real father involved in his life. A few days later, Kayla sent one more message through our agreed communication channel. It was a short note thanking me for handling everything with more grace than she probably deserved. She wrote that therapy had been helping her understand how toxic her fetishization of racial ambiguity had been, and she was working hard on being a better person and mother. I read it, thought about it for a few minutes, then typed back a brief message wishing her continued growth and healing. After I sent it, I archived the entire conversation thread so I wouldn't be tempted to keep checking it. My mom called again and invited me to dinner, but this time it was just going to be me and my childhood best friend James, who I had completely lost touch with during my identity performance phase. I hadn't talked to James in almost 2 years because I had been too busy pretending to be someone else and avoiding people who knew the real me. We met at my mom's house and caught up over her pot roast. I explained everything that had happened, not hiding my mistakes or trying to make myself look better than I was. James listened to the whole story, asked a few questions, and then told me he was glad I was figuring things out, but also that I had been a jerk for ghosting our friendship when I was pretending to be someone else. He said it straight up without being mean about it, and I realized I needed to hear that. I apologized for disappearing and he accepted it, and we spent the rest of dinner talking about normal stuff like his new job and the video games we used to play together. The next week, I joined a gym near my apartment, not because I wanted to change how I looked, but because I realized I felt better physically when I was active. Some days at the gym, I still caught myself worrying about being too pale or too plain compared to other guys there. But I was learning to notice those thoughts when they came up without letting them control what I did. Progress felt slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was real. A few weeks later, Wallace sent me a final email with the subject line, "Case closed, final documentation." I opened it at my desk during lunch break, scanning through the formal language about how all legal matters were fully resolved and I had zero parental obligations or rights regarding the child. He included a paragraph of advice about what to say if anyone ever contacted me claiming I had responsibilities, suggesting I refer them to my attorney and provide no other information. I saved the email in a folder labeled Legal Resolved and closed my laptop, sitting back in my chair and feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Freedom. Not the fake freedom of pretending to be someone else, but real freedom that came from everything being out in the open and dealt with honestly. I ate the rest of my sandwich and went back to work. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted. That weekend, I sat on my couch with my laptop and opened my dating app profiles for the first time since everything happened. I deleted all the old photos where my hair was dyed black and my skin was artificially tanned. I uploaded new pictures showing my actual blonde hair and pale skin, including one where I was hiking and you could see how red my face got in the sun. For my bio, I wrote about my real interests like science fiction books and cooking complicated recipes, leaving out any vague hints about Mediterranean heritage or North African ancestry. My finger hovered over the save button for a long time because making myself this visible and honest felt scary after years of hiding. But I remembered what my therapist told me during our last session, that hiding myself didn't actually protect me from getting hurt. It just delayed the hurt and made it worse when it finally came. I wasn't actively trying to date anyone yet, but having profiles that showed the real me felt like important progress anyway. I hit save and closed the app, my heart beating fast but feeling proud of myself for being brave enough to be honest. 6 months after the baby was born, I was at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, buying tomatoes from my favorite stand. I turned around with my bag of vegetables and almost walked straight into Kayla, pushing a stroller, Jeremiah walking beside her with his hand on her shoulder. We all froze for a second, then exchanged quick hellos that were polite but not warm. The baby was sleeping in the stroller between them, bigger now and wearing a little sun hat. I looked down at him for just a moment, seeing those same features that had revealed everything 6 months ago, and felt sad but not destroyed like I might have expected. Kayla asked how I was doing and I said fine. Then Jeremiah mentioned they were late for meeting his parents. We said goodbye and moved in opposite directions through the market crowd, and that was it. No dramatic scene, no emotional breakdown, just 3 people who used to be tangled up in each other's lives now living separately and moving forward. I bought some fresh bread and went home, the whole encounter feeling less significant than I thought it would be. Now I'm sitting in my apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee and a book, sunlight coming through the window and hitting my natural blonde hair. My pale skin isn't hidden under layers of fake tan anymore, just regular pale skin that burns easy and freckles in summer. I'm not completely healed from everything that happened with Kayla and the baby, and all the lies we both told. Some days I still catch myself wondering if I'm boring or too plain, if those girls in college were right about me being vanilla. But I'm learning to exist as myself without performing for anyone, building a life based on truth instead of fear about what other people think. The girl from college who told me women like guys with flavor would probably still think I'm not interesting enough, but I'm starting to believe that's her problem, not mine. That's my version of what happened. Now it's your turn because I know some of you are already forming strong opinions. Leave them in the comments I'll be reading through later. You always make these stories better.